Trail and Ultra Runners, what is going on? What's happening? Welcome to another episode of the Koopcast. As always, I am your humble host, Coach Jason Koop, and I am extremely excited about this podcast today, and that is because it is with something that is brand spanking new on the podcast. It is about a technology and a device that is just in its pre-order stage right now. In fact, the week that this podcast goes out, the pre-orders will actually be going live, and that is just sheer coincidence of me and the guest's schedule. On the podcast today, I have the CEO of NYX Biosensors, and that is Meredith Cass. The longtime listeners of this podcast will know that one's hydration status and being able to have a solid hydration plan throughout the course of an ultramarathon is one of the biggest things that you can do for yourself to ensure your performance. However, getting to the answer of what I should be drinking and how much of what I should be drinking and how much should I be drinking across different temperature and intensity ranges is something of great mystery. We've tried to pin this answer down on a number of previous podcasts, and you guys can go check out the one with Andy Blow in particular. We mentioned him during this podcast. But to do it in the field, to send an athlete out into the field under a certain condition and have them track their sweat losses and the electrolyte composition within their sweat is something that is extremely problematic. I've done that research, and we put patches on people and taken patches off people and wrung those patches out and analyzed them and put them on treadmills and measured the sweat coming off of them and rinsed them off and measured all of the water and sweat that went down into a drain. And all of those solutions, in my estimation, are either archaic or too complicated for the average person. And what Meredith is trying to do with her company, NYX Biosensors, is to try to make that relatable and in a format that the everyday consumer out there can actually get their hands off of, where you out there, everybody listening out there, can simply put a patch on their arm, go out and run, and figure out how much you're sweating and what the electrolyte composition of that sweat is in order to inform your hydration plan for race day. I met Meredith in December of 2021 at the running event of all places. And the running event is a huge running industry trade show where they were doing their product launch there. And this, I might add, is an extremely bold move. And we talk about that during the very beginning portions of this podcast. Now, the entirety of this podcast might seem like a little bit of a shill. You longtime listeners of this podcast know that it is not. I have not, and I did not, and I will not take any sponsors for this podcast. And it is precisely because I want to have conversations like this. I want to have conversations with new people that are in the space in an unbiased format, in a way where I don't feel tethered to the ultimate outcome of that conversation, nor the endorsement or lack of endorsement of that particular product or method. However, I will say that if Meredith's claims come to fruition and this product actually works as it is intended to work and as the initial data indicates it will, I think that this one is a game changer. And I do not say that a lot. In fact, more often than not, I'm being very cynical about some of the products that are coming to market where they promise way more than they actually deliver. I do not think that that is going to be the case with what NYX Biosensors has. But you guys can be the ultimate judge of that. So here we go. I'm getting right out of the way. Here's my conversation with Meredith Cass, the CEO of NYX Biosensors. So you guys launched at the running event at TRE, and I did not know that at the time. Bold move on your part. That is not, I see companies every once in a while go to the running event and launch their products, but you have a technology product that could go horrifically wrong if you launch it there. And before we get like too far into it, because I think this will kind of start to paint the picture of just how you and I first met and interacted. take the listeners through this launch at TRE that you went through and what you were trying to communicate to the audience, because it was really fun. I just
Yeah.
thought it was a cool scene.
Well, thank you. No, I mean, first of all, yeah, it probably was a really bold move. And I would say when we were planning it, as I'm sure people sort of gather about the world of startups, is really nothing goes to plan, right? So, we might have intended to have our coming out party be in a smaller scale, maybe a marathon expo over the fall or whatever the case may be. But TRE is just one of those events that's just pretty epic, and you really just can't miss that opportunity. So we kind of doubled down and put the pressure on ourselves to say, let's just create the most captivating activation we can with the limitations that we know are going to be placed upon us. The first one being, that we don't have a dry run somewhere else. And the second one just being, placement, as a brand new brand that's never been to the running event before, we don't get prime placement on the floor. So we had to really think creatively about how are we going to drive people to the booth. We knew we sat behind Saucony in particular, who put up a big wall right in front of our booth. So we just, we had to think about that. And so we were pretty excited to be able to partner with, specifically with Mike Wardian and Sally McRae to really build awareness and not just bring people to the booth so we had a chance to show them what we were working on, but also to really illustrate exactly how the product works by having them do a live demo right there in the booth.
And this is why, just to make the listeners appreciate this kind of introduction, this is why that's such a bold move, because
Yeah.
anything can happen. Your
Yeah.
treadmill can break, the sensors
Yep.
cannot work, the athletes can fail, not that they're going
Yeah.
all that hard, but there's like all these multiple like small failure points. And you mentioned that, yeah, you could have taken a small step and like dose tested it a little bit at a
Yeah.
regional marathon expo, but you went to the running event where all of the buyers are there, all of the
That's
stores are
right.
there, all the idiots like me are there trying to like figure the whole thing out. And if you said a bad impression, you're now setting a bad impression
Yes.
across the entire
Very
ecosystem
publicly.
of all of runners right out of the gate. And with something new, that's super critical, right? I mean, if you get it
Yeah.
wrong right out of the gate, it's like everybody
Yeah.
just goes, man, I saw it at the running event, it didn't work.
Yeah. No, 100%. And maybe that gives you a little insight into my personality. I'm a very, go big, go home kind of person. So no, and I mean, at the end of the day, it ended up very much in our favor. Of course, we had snafus. We hope they were invisible to the attendees. And we suspect maybe they were if we're lucky, but yeah, we had a really good show.
Okay, so you mentioned your go big or go home person, and I want the listeners to kind of understand like who you are and who your team is before we get into the product and the use cases itself. So
Yeah.
I think I met all of them as well at the running
Yeah.
event. So who like who is this new company that
Yeah.
is starting to take the small part of the marketplace?
Yeah, and I'll try not to bore anybody with kind of the founding story, but I think it's relevant in sort of the direction that we're thinking about for the technology, which is that I actually conceived of Nix while I was in an entrepreneur in residence program, which specifically means it was just me, nobody else, for the first 12 months while I was sort of ideating and figuring out exactly what we wanted the company to be. And of course, at that point, we is the royal we, because I just said it was just me for the first 12 months, but really sussing out like, what's the pain point? What are all the nuances of it? What would a best fit engineered solution to that problem look like in all of its features, all the way down to cost? And so personally, it's sort of a little bit of soapbox material here, but I come from a long history of venture creation from the investor seat, from the venture capital seat. And I feel so strongly that the right way to build any company, regardless of what you're doing, is to figure out the problem you're solving, make sure it's a meaningful problem for a large number of people. And like I said, just understand every nuance of that problem so that you can engineer the best fit solution. Because too many companies are doing the opposite, which is, let me see what cool stuff I can build, which is a noble pursuit, but then forcing it down someone's throat and trying to figure out how to sell it to them. So those first 12 months were really about what exactly is it that we're trying to build? What does it need to look like? Because then that gave me the opportunity to figure out who was the team to help bring it to life. So now, as we sit today, we made a hire the week of the running event. By the way, she started just that week. So we are a team of 7. We are very small and scrappy. We're mostly based in the Boston area. having spun out of Harvard, but getting a little more dispersed as we go. So it's, 3 on the commercial side, 3 on the product side, and me.
Okay. So fundamentally, what problem are you trying to solve?
This is such a great question because as we think about where we are right now in the very early stages of our company, in the very early stages of commercialization, we are all about that sort of hydration coach in an endurance athlete's ear. So that's about how do we give them real-time data that's actually coming off their body, not some generic calculation like calorimetry, which has limitations with respect to accuracy. But how do we measure the sweat and the content of the sweat coming off an endurance athlete's body and give them that information in the most seamless way, presumably on some device they're already using, like their Garmin watch, so that they know exactly when, what, and how much to drink and build that hydration strategy. That is the core of what we're doing.
And to that problem, I can tell you as a practitioner in the field for the last 20 years, that's an important problem to solve. It's also not a very easy one.
No.
and so I think that before we get into Nix specifically, there are other ways to try to solve this problem.
Yeah.
And they range from kind of what I use, which are caveman and cavewoman ways, very simplistic, very rudimentary, very generic, to complicated and invasive and may not be relevant is the scope of the current solutions that are out there. And I mean that with all seriousness. The people that are watching the YouTube can see Meredith nodding her head over at the other end, because I've always viewed that as not acceptable in the endurance community and in the athletic community. When I look at kind of how we have to do this, I'm just like, this is a terrible way to do it. It's rife with error. You're not getting the right results, and you're doing something where, in many cases, not all cases, many cases, the counsel that you're providing based on the information that you're getting is material to the outcome. And if you don't have the right information, you're just kind of guessing that you get it right. So let's lay the landscape of how one would solve this hydration coach in your ear problem before Nix entered the scene. And I think that it's just a good setup to, if I really wanted to do this right, or at least try to do it right, this is how I would go about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like you framed that perfectly too, because obviously I'm biased in that we conceived of this solution, but to hear someone else iterate the thoughts around like the way that we have to solve it now, or the methods that we have, are legitimately archaic. I mean, that just sort of validates exactly what we're trying to do, right? So, the way we look at it is whether you are somebody at the front of the pack or the back of the pack. And I should mention, when we think about for whom we solved this technology, it's endurance athletes across all sports, running, cycling, tri, but also from the front of the pack to the back of the pack. So we know that there are differences in some practices of how a really dedicated athlete, especially, an elite or a sub-elite athlete, might approach something like this. But the reality is the tools are all the same, and they are thirst, first and foremost, right? Use what God gave us. And I'll sort of go through what these are and then the challenges as I see them. But thirst is sort of first and foremost. Second is you can absolutely do weigh-ins and do some understanding, some calculations of what your average sweat rate might be. And then the third one, this one really cracks me up. If you do any Googling around hydration strategy, you're going to get one of two things. You're going to get a recommendation to look at your urine color, which makes me laugh every time. Or you're going to get some generic guideline, and a representative guideline might say, drink somewhere between 500 milliliters and 1.5 liters per hour. So the challenges with all of these, first and foremost with thirst, there's now a really robust body of literature out there that basically says if you're relying on thirst, you're going to end up consuming about 50% of the fluids you've lost. Most of that literature comes from the Soldier Research Center here in Massachusetts, who studied that pretty extensively. But that's the real challenge there. Thirst is going to get you 50% of the way there. The second one with weigh-ins is actually the gold standard of measuring sweat rate and fluid needs. So it's actually pretty accurate. The problem is it's completely useless when you're out in the field. You're not going to be weighing yourself before and after a workout or a race. And it changes every day. So, your sweat rate, intuitively, we know your sweat rate's not the same when it's, 30 degrees out and overcast like it is here in Boston today versus, 70 degrees and 80% humidity in bright sun somewhere else. So, that sweat rate is accurate, but it only helps you on that one day, and it's completely obsolete the next day. Urine color, pretty obvious why that's not useful in the field. You're probably not urinating into something with a white background that you can even assess what the color of that urine is. Not to mention, usually that's a better measure of what your kidneys are doing than what your hydration status is. And we can get into that, but I always use the very glib example of if you're out drinking with your friends, your urine is clear, but it's not because you're well hydrated. It's because of what your kidneys are being signaled to do in that moment in time. So those are some of the challenges right there. The last one on the guidelines is just illustrative, obviously, of the massive variability among athletes. And we see it in terms of sweat rate and composition of that sweat. We see certain trends by age, gender, fitness level, or heat acclimatization, but by all means, it's a massive distribution of sweat rate that really there just can't be a sort of one size fits all. So that prompts people to the trial and error, right? A lot of your listeners are a lot more experienced than some of these sort of, first time marathoner, for example. But even then, we see elite athletes getting it wrong all the time. And, I always think back to, we have a relationship with Shalene Flanagan. We think all the time to the 2016 trials in LA, where she barely made that third position and made the team. So, it happens, this sort of guessing game goes wrong, regardless of where you sit in the pack.
So you went through a lot of field activities, and I'll throw out my anecdote right here while you get the lab ones queued up in your head as well. So we've done field ones where it's kind of a little bit of a high rate versus a field in the lab, where we're using weight in the field. And we've used this a lot in like team settings, right? So you have a team, they go out and practice, they're wearing some sort of absorbent patch on their skin. You weigh them before, you weigh them afterwards. That gives you the total amount of sweat loss. And that's even problematic. I hate to like trivialize it. Is that like, that's not an easy thing to do when you want to get precise measurements. But then you're collecting those patches and somehow extracting the sweat out of it and then analyzing that sweat with laboratory kind of great equipment. And I remember when we do this with teams, everybody would have their own like individual like Tupperware that it would sit in and labeled. And, you'd bring it back to the lab and you'd either wring it out or like literally wring it out or like extract it somehow with a syringe, but all very, and that's not quote unquote invasive, but all just very archaic, where I just look at, I'd get it to the end of the day and be like, okay, I've got some useful information here, but there's got to be a better way. There's got to be a better way. So we've also tried to do this in the lab, which even gets more ridiculous in my opinion. And you know how it's traditionally done in the lab. So how would we take some of these field studies and actually do it in a laboratory study where we're trying to determine sweat rate and sweat composition?
Yeah. And some of the technologies you're referring to also, the challenges, like you said, is that you're not actually even getting moment by moment data, right? You're having to, especially if you're using some of these absorbent patches, you're having to wait maybe 15, 30 minutes for there to be a volume of sweat collected that you can even wring out and put into the machine, which for us is a benchtop osmometer, that you can even put, you need 50 microliters for that. You might need half an hour to gather the amount of sweat to do that. So, that was a big focus for us, is how do we make sure, again, if we're thinking forward to the best fit solution, we're thinking about something that's updating continuously in real time, right? So how do we bring some of those lab-based methods out to the field so that it's convenient for a user? The answer is we use a device that's not just collecting all your sweat in one bolus that you measure at the end. It's that we are sampling it every single second to see how that's changing in real time. Because the reality is your workout is changing, right? The weather is changing over the course of your workout. You might be going up a hill. You might be, especially if you're in training, you might be changing your intensity or your pace throughout that workout. So what we did was we tried to leverage, certainly the weigh-ins and things like that we use as our gold standard. That's how we calibrate our algorithms. But the intent was learning, like, we need to be making sort of these micro measurements every second and then reporting them back to the user in aggregate in a way that's actually going to be actionable for them.
Okay, so we're getting into the patch a little bit. So let's describe just try to describe what the patch visually looks like to this person who's not watching the YouTube, who's just listening to the podcast.
Right.
Size, scope, how heavy it is, where does it go, like all those things, just so we can kind of get a mental image of what's going on here, and then we can kind of go into how it actually works.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, and I will show it for those that are watching on the video, but we think about our platform in kind of three components. Two of them actually get paired together and worn on the body. The patch is the main piece. That's an adhesive piece. You literally peel a backing off and stick it to your arm. It's about 2 inches or so in diameter, 2.25 inches. Attached to that is a small electronic component, which we call the pod. So those literally pair together physically. There's a nice little click when those are paired together, and those get stuck directly on the bicep. There's a lot of reasons why we like the bicep instead of somewhere else on the body. We'll come back to that. But what's happening there is that patch is the piece that is collecting the sweat. And the pod is providing just enough electronic power to make those readings and then send the data via Bluetooth. So put together, the pod is smaller than the patch. Together, they're, like I said, about 2.25 inches in diameter. They weigh less than half an ounce, very, very lightweight. And they're smaller than the Garmin, or at least the pod is much smaller.
Good visual there. Very nice. Good visual with the Garmin.
So I will say too, the adhesive on the patch is made of a kinesiology tape, very similar to KT tape or rock tape, if some of you guys are using that. But really, there's a sort of the reports that we get from testing is once you've put that on the body, you kind of forget about it altogether. And then you'll get that data on your phone if you're an athlete that does that. More likely you're somebody that's using a Garmin watch, or if you're a cyclist, maybe your bike computer. But again, wanted to make it as unobtrusive as possible.
And so it's measuring sweat throughout the course of an activity, workout, race, or whatever.
Yeah.
What's the range of that capability? Can it keep measuring it for 30 minutes, for an hour, for 2 hours? We just mentioned some of the practical limitations of measuring things in the field. Like, what are the practical limitations of continuously measuring it through the Nix device?
Yeah, I mean, I won't bore you with sort of the scientific detail of how to solve that problem, but many microfluidic devices do have sort of a timestamp on the limitation of how long they're useful for, because once that path is full,
right,
the physics of it are that the fluid stops flowing through, and so you stop getting readings. So we were very careful to design it so that it could be used in a way that the patch technically never expires. There's no limit to how long it can be used. So the sort of usage limiting factor is actually the battery. So we designed the battery to be capable of taking readings and reporting readings for up to 24 hours. That's what it's currently capable of. And certainly there are ways to tune that up or down as we potentially roll out future versions of this.
So if I want to go run the Leadville Char 100, which usually takes me about 20 hours on a good year, I could wear the patch the whole time and theoretically get sweat sodium and sweat rate measurements the entire time.
That is correct. And that was a very deliberate choice for us. Is like, we cannot build
my 20-hour Leadville marathon
for ultra marathoners, right? Yeah, we cannot build I mean, literally that's the proving ground, right? We'll get into the physiology of dehydration and why it's so much harder for longer distances. But even though the ultra marathoning field is pretty small compared to endurance sports, at large, we absolutely knew we had to, create a solution that was going to work for this segment.
Well, I was curious about that, starting from when I walked up and saw Sally and Mike Wardian, two great ambassadors. Yeah. At the running event. And so my audience, sometimes they kind of get lost in things. The running is like 90% road in marathon and stuff like that, and maybe 10% trail and ultra. So to pick those two athletes very specifically for what you're doing is very telling. But we're gonna pause that for a second, because we're still on the device itself. So whenever you come up with these things, you've mentioned this earlier, you have to measure it against a gold standard.
Yeah.
And there are going to be people out there that will always say, how in the world is this little tiny device capable of what these huge bench lab instruments are capable of, that are 100 or 200 times bigger and 500 times more expensive, and
Yeah.
have to be handled with very, delicate gloves, quite literally, so to speak.
Yeah.
What is it measured against? And how would you kind of like describe the validation, I guess, of the technology that you're using?
Yeah, really good questions. These are so important ones. And the reality is anybody that's taking a massive scale lab-based instrument and miniaturizing it to be worn on the body, of course, there's a little bit of a trade-off in accuracy, right? Are we 100% accurate? No, of course we're not. And that was never the goal. The goal is, how do we take these really sort of validated, time-tested, lab-based, practices and create a version of that that's practical and accessible and affordable on the road. So specifically what we did is, I was sort of alluding earlier to a certain amount of fluid that needs to be collected to put that into a benchtop osmometer. That is the gold standard. An osmometer, by the way, uses freezing point depression to understand the electrolyte content of a fluid, obviously in this case, sweat. So that is the lab-based method at the moment, right? You're collecting some volume of sweat, you're squeezing it out into a little vial that you're putting into a benchtop osmometer. So instead of making you run with a benchtop osmometer, which is probably the size of a bread box, what we did was basically create, no visuals here on the podcast, but we created a flow path through this patch that has two electrodes. One of them is stimulating an electrical signal and the other one is receiving it. And in between is your sweat. So what's happening is we're sending that signal through your sweat, and the more electrolytes are in that sample between those two electrolytes, the better that electrical signal is conducted. When the electrolyte content there is lower, that signal is not conducted as well. It is impeded more. So based on the value between those two electrodes that we're measuring, we can understand with very good precision, the electrolyte content between those two electrodes. And then we use other methods. We know exactly how far apart those electrodes are spaced. We know exactly how much signal we're sending in. So when we get that impedance signal through the sweat, that's how we understand exactly what the electrolyte content is. For fluid losses, what we then do
let me
is,
put a pause on that.
we
So
stop
what you
there.
mean, so electrolyte content being what, right? Because there's a lot of electrolyte content in sweat. Let's make sure that we kind of run through the whole thing.
Yeah, exactly. So what we're looking at right now is what's referred to as osmolality. So we are looking at the concentration of sweat in aggregate. Right now, we don't have ion specificity, so we're not going to be giving you how many milligrams of sodium versus potassium versus chloride. That is something that will be a future feature for us. But right now it's looking at electrolyte content as a whole in aggregate.
Okay, I think that's important for people to understand, because very unfortunately so, and we can talk about why this is unfortunate. Yes. Too much detail gets put on some of the other electrolytes that are not all that meaningful, but that's
that's a good point. No, it's a really good point. And just the realities of a tiny venture-backed company is unfortunately we had to create a wish list of what makes the first cut and what are we going to roll out post launch.
Okay. So let's go to the concept. Let's go to the volume then piece.
Yeah. Getting into. So that exact method I was just describing that gives us electrolyte content, we do with those two electrodes. We do that exact same process further down the flow path in the exact same patch. So we actually have two pairs of these electrodes inside our patch. The reason doing it twice gives us fluid losses is that because in real time, our algorithm is looking at the live data. I'm sort of, if anybody's watching the video, I'm sort of showing what that data stream might look like.
It's a sine wave.
Over time, right? There's a wave. Yeah. It seems counterintuitive, but we're not just sweating at a flat electrolyte rate at all times. It actually is fluctuating. So as our sensor is measuring those fluctuations at that first pair of electrodes and doing the exact same at that second pair of electrodes, there's a delay as the sweat is moving from point A to point B, from the first pair of electrodes to the second pair. So what our algorithm is doing is it's identifying those local peaks and troughs in those waveforms and identifying what the time delay is from point A to point B. And so by doing that, our algorithm knows how quickly the sweat is moving through the system. So I mentioned earlier that patch is just sitting on the bicep. We have been very specific about knowing the surface area of the bicep that our sensor is collecting sweat from. There's a very specific opening in that patch. So basically that time delay that I was just mentioning, that's telling us the local sweat rate right there on the bicep. It's just for that tiny footprint on the bicep. So we have a whole nother set of algorithms, and this is honestly, this is the trickiest part, whole nother set of algorithms that's extrapolating what's happening on the bicep to what's happening across the entire surface area of the body. And the reason that one's so hard is because obviously we sweat very differently at different sites on the body.
And the reason that I mentioned some of the more archaic ways of analyzing sweat and that we've used over the years is just for what you just mentioned, because a lot of people are going to think, how indicative is my sweat rate across this area of my whole body? And if you can imagine, there has been, I would call it copious amounts. Maybe somebody would not describe it as that much, but I think it's copious amounts of research where they've just had patches everywhere.
Yeah.
Have them on their shoulder, have them on their bicep, have them on their leg, have them on their calf, have them on their lower back, on their upper back, on their forehead. But I don't know if forehead's actually one of them. I'm just making that
Absolutely
part
it is. Yep.
Okay, so there you go. Forehead's actually one of them. I got that one right, despite myself. And correlated all of those across large population sets.
Yeah.
Yes, there's individual variability, but essentially your algorithms, right, are taking that well-established research and saying, we know what the bicep is. How does that translate into whole body sweat? You're not just making it up.
Yep,
you're using an
exactly
established body of literature of what I would say that that's a robust body of literature in my estimation.
I think so too. And I think, that's obviously partly why we leverage it. And it's also an opportunity for us to, leverage what's already known, right? There's certain economies of scale that we need to be considering as a startup as well, that we don't have the opportunity to completely reinvent that body of literature. So why not leverage what these experts have already discovered, where, we can come up with our own sort of nuanced innovations without reinventing that piece, that sort of local to full body extrapolation. If that already exists in the public domain, by all means, we'll leverage it.
Absolutely. So speaking of the public domain, I'm going to put you on the spot on the validation piece of this, because I actually don't know if this is in the public domain. Is your validation work in the public domain yet?
It is not yet.
Okay, I didn't think so. Okay, how much of the curtain can you peel back on that? Because once again, you've got a product, people are trusting it, that it's telling them exactly what's going on. It's not in a magic black box or anything like that and just spitting out kind of random numbers. And I know, I have enough trust in you just in our few interactions that we've had to ascertain that you have looked at what your sensors are spitting out compared to what the gold standard is. So what can you tell the listeners about that, even though it hasn't been put in the public domain yet?
Yeah, absolutely happy to share, because it is so important. So we think about that validation, that body of our own internal validation, in a few different ways. The first one is that we actually break down each step of how our patch and our algorithms work, and we validate each individual step. So for example, that first step of how do we know that whatever impedance signal we're getting correlates really well to the osmolality of, the fluid or the sweat that's measured there. So we will break down just that piece and validate just that piece, which by the way is in the 99% range. Then that second piece of how do we make sure that there's a temperature correction piece in there as well, right? So if you're taking that measurement at 37 degrees versus 90 degrees, that measurement is actually, it changes a little bit because of the properties of that fluid, expansion, contraction, and so on. Think back to, chemistry 101. So there are steps like that we can isolate and test. And all of those are in the 98 to 99% range, which we're very, very content with. Broader, more macro scale is where it gets harder. So with fluid losses, as we mentioned, if we're thinking, tally up the data that our sensor is collecting, tally up the fluid losses and the electrolyte losses over the course of a workout. How do we validate that our total electrolytes and fluid ounces lost measures up with what actually happened? We use some of those same lab-based methods that we talked about before. So we will put somebody, maybe it's in an environmental chamber, or maybe it's just at room temperature, but we do very carefully restrict fluid intake, we restrict it to a time period where they're not using the restroom or doing any other activities that are going to change their weight. It is very laborious.
Those research designs suck. They suck.
Oh, it's
They're
horrible.
So hard to do.
Yeah,
so
it's horrible, but it's so important. And I'm sort of coming back around to how we then are planning on publicizing some of this information. But it's so important that we do that to make sure that we're in a range of accuracy that's going to be, first of all, helpful, not hurtful, because we'll get into this. But if there's a certain tolerance for our product of making sure that, if we have any instances of inaccuracy, how do we ensure that an athlete's not going to get hurt, right? That's our number one priority. And then the third one is, on-body electrolyte losses. There's actually no way to do that on body. The only way we can do that is, and you were alluding to these earlier, some of these crazy lab-based methods, we have to literally do a full body wash down to wash all of the electrolytes off the surface of somebody's skin, collect all of that in a drain in the floor, and then measure that. So some of these lengths that we've gone to are really quite detailed, but I'll give you a little spoiler alert. We have not yet published this data, but for the first validation study, where I think it was 76 subjects, if I'm not mistaken, we found that our accuracy was 83%. So to put some definition around what that means, if somebody lost, 10 ounces, we were within 83% accuracy of that number. And the reason that's important for us, first of all, we referenced earlier that drinking to thirst only gets you to about 50%. So it was really important that we far exceeded the tools that athletes have available to them today. But the second piece is, thinking about what is that, if it's 83% accurate, what is that extra 17% leaving behind? Are we risking, like I said earlier, the safety of that athlete? And the reality is, the way that we did the analysis is that 17% error, if that's what we want to call it, still kept athletes within 1% of their starting body mass. And we can take a little sort of tangent here and talk about how we define dehydration. But basically what that means is we kept athletes, if they followed our data, we kept athletes within 1% of their starting body mass, which is amazing. I mean, we couldn't have dreamt of results that good.
Yeah. And so I appreciate the candidness that you have with that, because I think all too often when devices come out, they purport things that they are actually not, either in terms of accuracy or the totality of what they are actually presenting. And I just hope the listeners can appreciate A, the multi-step part of it, but B, just being very honest about, we realize that there's going to be some accuracy loss, and is that accuracy loss tolerable in an athletic context?
Right.
And as long as I know that, once again, I'm taking this information, or athletes are taking this information and saying, yeah, drink more, drink less, drink more stuff with electrolytes in it, drink less stuff with electrolytes in it. It kind of comes down to that, right?
Right.
If you can get it to the level of granularity that you need to present that advice, good. And you can get more widespread adoption, great. You've solved the problem there.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that candidness with which you're gonna present that. When is all that research due out? Can you give a ballpark?
Yeah, so we are in the process of launching our new website that's got a lot more content, including a lot of white papers that we've written internally. But we're also in this, we're sort of focused here right now on the endurance athlete, and we don't, I don't need to bore your listeners with kind of what our commercial path as a company looks like, but we envision a path that expands from endurance, from the endurance athlete to the team sport athlete, to the tactical athlete in the context of the military, and then the industrial athlete, which, is anything from firefighting to construction working to agricultural. So we have a whole sort of roadmap in front of us that we need to consider as we think about our validation package and information that we put out there. So we already have certain pilot partnerships underway with groups across that whole spectrum, which are basically we'll be producing peer-reviewed literature that will be published more widely.
So the listeners of this podcast are going to know, are you going to have a data set that's bigger than Andy Blows? Because that's his claim to fame. He's got we both know Andy. He's a colleague
Right.
of both of ours. He's been on the podcast, and I'll link
Yep.
that up in the show notes. But his claim to fame is he has the biggest data set on this, not in the exact same context that you have, but from the
Sure.
sweat sodium composition. And I believe him that he has that.
Absolutely.
You might exceed that because your stuff is more portable, essentially.
Well, I certainly think that when we really engage and roll out our pre-sales and then certainly our commercial launch, I mean, the lit to the amount of data that we can collect is, I mean, there is no limit, right? That's the beauty of the way that we've designed the product, is that we ship it to you, you use it, and it kind of goes forward. So while Andy, who's wonderful, and his team have had, years of opportunity to be collecting this bolus of data, it's more on sort of a one-off perspective. I mean, our initial packaging has four patches, four use cases right in that first package that becomes sort of automated. So what I get excited about is just the massive potential of that data that we can then back correlate to things like, what was the temperature for that data set? What was the humidity? How fast were they running? Were they male or female? I mean, the insights that we can pull out of that data set on the back end. Once we have, I mean, I'll say right now, we've got about 10,000 people on our pre-orders list that this 10,000 data points right there. And if they use the full package, it's 40,000. So, that data explosion is very real.
Throw the gauntlet down right out of the get-go. Yeah, but you started shipping it. I love it. I love it. It's so good. Inevitably, what happens with that stuff, and you know this better than I do, right? Is when you get better, or a wider and a more broad set of people using it, you realize how much more individualized all of these different things that you're measuring are. I mean, anytime you've moved a data set from the N of 12 that you get in this typical sports science world to the N of thousands or the N's of tens of thousands, that bell curve gets a little bit wider each time you get that iteration. And I think this is going to be one of those, inevitably over the course of time. We got time to figure that out though. That's a lot of people, to go through.
Exactly.
Okay, let's circle back to the ultra running stuff.
Yeah.
This is super curious for me, and you can satiate my curiosity first, and then we'll get to the practical point of it second. So I'm going at the running event. I know it's a lot of road running nerds, the carbon fiber shoes everywhere, and 10 ounce handheld water bottles, and that's kind of the scene there.
Yep.
You had two ultra runners in your booth at the running event, running on a treadmill, using using the Nix patches. Is that what you're officially calling them? The Nix patches?
Yeah, Biosensor.
I want to make sure I get the brand. They're so new. I don't even know what I'm talking about.
Exactly.
Two ultra runners there specifically. And yes, Mike and Sally are great. They're great ambassadors. They're great humans. They're great people. But it's in my mind, I'm switching from my coach hat to my marketing hat. I view that as a deliberate choice by a new manufacturer to put on the treadmill to ultra runners in a road-centric environment. Why was that?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is just the very basics of sort of illustrating that if our technology and our product can work for sort of the peak of the peak, right? The tip of that pyramid, if it can be deployed over a 24-hour period, if it can handle the types of, cumulative fluid losses and electrolytes that an athlete of that caliber is putting it through its paces, then in theory it should work for any other athlete that follows behind them, whether they're at a shorter distance or a slower pace or whatever the case may be. So, I mean, it's always strategic when you're working with athletes to really almost illustrate these sort of edge cases, if you will, these extreme cases, to signal to the rest of the folks that, it's probably going to work for their needs too.
You could have cajoled Mike into doing a 24-hour treadmill run.
We talked about it. He wanted to do something crazy.
Oh, he would have done it.
Oh, he would have loved it. He literally said, like, how many hours do you want us on the treadmill? I said 4. And he said, oh, that's no problem.
4. Can I get there before so I can get my workout in?
Exactly.
But so kind of reeling it back to the practical standpoint, I think ultramarathon is your best target audience in terms of how much impact it can actually have. And I've talked about this with a number of hydration experts on this podcast, because you can get away with doing stupid things for
Yes.
1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours,
Yes.
maybe even 5 hours if the conditions are correct.
Yeah.
But it's hard to do that in an ultramarathon situation. You pay the penalty for failure quite dramatically so, and we see
Yes.
this, you mentioned earlier, you see this kind of you see this like littered across the competitive landscape, where even professional athletes and elite athletes, they screw this up, and
Yeah.
it could have horrific consequences from a
Yep.
performance perspective in ultra running. I think that's your like market to figure it out first.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, that's the proving ground, right? Like just this concept that I mean, it exists at every distance, but especially at ultra, it's, every decision that you're making from a hydrating and fueling perspective from literally mile one, it has cumulative impact as you get further along, right? I'm not an ultra marathoner, full disclosure. I am a very average marathoner. I'm a 4-hour marathoner,
Look
total
at your
middle of the
Boston
packer.
medal in the background. I can see
Do you
that.
see that? I'm very proud of
Yeah,
those.
very well placed.
But that adage of like the decisions that you make in miles 1 through 5 is a very sort of marathon centric concept, but is infinitely more true at the ultra distance. Is those decisions you're making in the first 5 miles have everything to do with how you're feeling and performing in the last 5 miles. And again, it's just that's amplified tenfold when you're talking about 100-mile, 150-mile races and longer.
100%. So how are you advising people actually use the product? And I think this might get to some brass tacks with athletes that are out there that are listening, that are either thinking about just figuring this thing out for themselves anyway, right?
Yeah.
I think I'm a salty sweater, or I always have,
Right.
these issues in long or hot races or whatever. And some
Right.
of the way that you recommend using this product, it obviously, helps move the product, but also it helps kind of
Sure.
stimulate people to think, okay, this is how I could potentially go and solve this. So
Right.
somebody inquires to your sales team, or somebody, picks up a box of them. We'll go over like how they're shipped and distributed and things like that in a
Sure.
second. Like,
Yep.
how are you advising that they actually use it to glean this information out of it?
Yeah, and this is one of the hardest parts, right? Because we know there's going to be a little bit different usage patterns depending on sport, depending on distance or talent level. The baseline for us, so that we can give some people some place to start from, is actually really analogous to fueling. So what we sort of say is, if you're turning in a workout that's in excess of, let's say, an hour, you should be thinking more strategically about your hydration. So what that looks like is, if you're turning in any workout midweek, long run, whatever the case may be, that's an hour or longer, use a patch that can start to measure what's happening on that workout. All that data, by the way, gets stored in the app and used for the future. So even if you're only doing, a 10-mile midweek run, right? Not something crazy, sort of high intensity or anything like that. Every data point that you use it for can help inform a future workout based on, I think the part we haven't really gotten to here is that as we're capturing all that sweat profile information, we're also capturing the environment that you were in when you produced that sweat profile. So we're capturing temperature, humidity, wind speed, cloud cover, altitude, all of those metrics, such that when you go for a future workout in similar conditions, we're going to calculate that sweat rate and electrolyte loss rate for you on that future day. So when you think about use cases, there's kind of two priorities. First is, what are the types of runs where I need that data in real time? And then also, how do I continue to fill out my own personal data sort of profile, my own sweat profile, so that I'm feeding that future predictive model?
And the way I look at it as a coach is, you're building a profile, right? You're building a
Yeah.
profile in mainly different temperature conditions, maybe temperature and humidity if there's a certain use case, and then
Yeah.
maybe intensity on top of that.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that's the most practical kind of use case, but I personally, I just do it 10-degree increments. I figure that
Yeah.
gives me enough granularity where I know what's going on. And so 4 to 6 patches would be the perfect kind of
Yeah.
if I were to send that package out to an athlete, like me buying it and sending it to one of my athletes, which I do a lot with technology. That's kind of how I would set it up. I'd get,
Yep.
4 to 6, I'd send them out, do them in these conditions. We'd build the profile, then we double
Yep.
check it, across kind of the critical ones, and just go from there.
Yep. And you nailed it. That's exactly how we package it. It's 4 patches per pack. Then again, it's sort of built with somebody like me. It probably only makes sense for me to use it on my long run because I'm not training for ultras. So that could be the base case, is you're using it once a week on that long run. But building up to, I mean, especially when we're thinking about our cycling and triathlon folks as well, I mean, there may be workouts or bricks midweek too that make sense. So, could be up to 3-4 times per week.
Yeah. So how does it stack up to the Gatorade patch, which people are going to be familiar with? I should have asked you this like 2 questions ago. It totally escaped me. But there is a light, what I would call a light competitor. And what I mean by that is like physically, at least, it looks exactly the same. It purports to do the exact same thing. It's almost like Garmin and Sunto, right? Or Garmin and Coros or whatever. It's a smartwatch. It captures GPS technology. What are the differences between those two? But this is something that's I'd say more early stage development, right? In terms of technology and things like that.
Sure.
What's the differences between those two now that people are going to be familiar with both products?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe I'll even start with the similarities. I mean, the differences in the actual patches are probably not even readily apparent, right? They're both disposable patches that you stick to the body one time, for Gatorade on the forearm, for us on the bicep, really seemingly similar use cases. Where each of those patches is trying to do some analytics on the sweat as it's coming off the body, which, there are competitors that have not launched yet, that are still sort of academic stage, that are trying to approach solving this problem in a totally different way. But that right there is direct sweat sensing is a very comparable approach. But that's kind of where the similarities end. On Gatorade's side, there are no electronics, which at first sort of blush may seem like a benefit. But the challenge there is that then the data that you're getting is not continuous or real time, for that matter. So our electronic component does have the added benefit of measuring that sweat every second and sending that data to your Garmin watch or your bike computer or whatever device you're already measuring that workout on. For Gatorade, you can only get that data at the end of your workout. You finish that workout, you scan it with your phone, with the camera on your phone, and it's giving you cumulative data, throughout that whole workout. So we'll give you that cumulative data at the end, but we're also giving it to you literally minute by minute or second by second while that workout is going on, and sending you notifications in the interim to say, as you set them, tell me every time I've lost 4 ounces so I can drink those 4 ounces, or however you want to interact with those notifications. The other big change, as far as the real-time data, which we offer, is there's not much of an opportunity for that predictive model in the Gatorade platform. They're not tracking your historical data. They're not correlating it with the environment in a way that you can look and say, all right, well, today I'm doing a workout and it's 70 degrees out or 50% humidity. What is my sweat rate likely to be? There's no recall through Gatorade unless you are putting in the exact workout that you've done before in the exact conditions that you've recorded it before. And there's no way to sort of visualize that. So that's kind of one of the main differences there. I mean, to get to a technical level, it is using different IP and stuff like that. But really, it's the use case. And then, maybe the sort of elephant in the room, obviously, is if you're using a Gatorade product, imagine what brand they might be trying to promote you to replenish with, right? So again, from the beginning, we've been really adamant that we are brand agnostic. We don't care what it is that you're hydrating with. We want to give you the data to make that selection.
And so first off, I appreciate your candor with that. How material are those differences? Because we went through a couple, we went through a couple scenarios of where even your own patch, right, has a level of inaccuracy associated with it as compared to the gold standard. But I would call that an acceptable amount of inaccuracy for the use case that we're looking at.
Right.
Taking that a step in this compare and contrast, how material are those actual differences to the end user?
Yeah, you're saying from the Gatorade type sensing method to ours. I mean, I think they're massive, and we don't have the opportunity of being internal employees at Gatorade. By the way, their patch is actually made by somebody else, so we don't have the opportunity to dive into their science and see what their validation data looks like. What we certainly can surmise is that, the Gatorade patches sensing method is built off of colorimetric dyes as opposed to any sort of electrochemical reading, which is what ours is. I mentioned those electrodes earlier. So their technology is built off varying shades of purple to understand, for example, the electrolyte content in your sweat. And that for that very reason, that's why you can't just look with your own human eye at the Gatorade patch and say, I'm in such and such an electrolyte range. That's why it has to be read at the end by the camera phone, right? It's looking at that sort of color analysis. So in my opinion, those colorimetric dyes, you almost think back to first year chemistry or like 8th grade chemistry. It's literally litmus paper.
That's exactly what I was just doing.
Yeah, that's literally what it is. It's litmus paper for your sweat, which if you ask me, is that really different than, assessing the color of your urine? Not really. It's kind of the same process. It's a color chart.
So when I dug into that technology, that is, Meredith, that's the exact same thing that I did. I thought back to my freshman year chemistry class and I'm some random titration experiment and going, could I the color of this is what I'm determining the advice off of. Like, do I want that to be the standard? And people are going to come up with analogies where that is actually the standard and things like that. But personally, I think in this use case, it's not the way we should be going because there's better technology out there. That's neither here nor there.
Right.
Let's get to real-time data. So you envision this from the onset as your hydration coach in your ear.
Yes.
And I don't know what state the app is in, right? But when athletes hear that, they're like, oh my gosh, somebody's going to tell me, drink now, drink now, drink now.
Yes.
Walk the users through how that advice is first generated. And we talked about building the profile earlier.
Yep.
And then obviously disseminated to the athlete. And I realize that there's, you've got product development that's looking at like 24 months by now, but let's try to take a real practical approach, like here and now. How are you collecting that advice, and then how are you ultimately disseminating it?
Yeah, and this is really the crux of it, right? This is the core of the value proposition, and it's really been our North Star from day one. Like everything we've heard from any athlete, regardless of talent level, gender, distance, has always been just tell me what to do and when to do it.
Yeah.
So that's how we built it. So basically we talked about how that data is being generated. It's getting, transferred from the patch to, the phone, the Garmin watch, whatever device by computer. So then what's happening is it's literally giving you moment by moment updates in a couple different ways. The baseline data is cumulative fluid losses and electrolyte losses throughout your workout. That's the baseline right there. But you can set a notification to also prompt you to drink and with what at intervals that you choose. So my favorite one is based on time. I would rather be told every 10 minutes or 15 minutes or whatever interval feels right to me. Let me know what my needs are in that cadence.
Oh, okay. So it's like 15 minutes, you've lost 4 ounces, replace 4 ounces with X, right?
Yes.
15 minutes, you've lost 8 ounces, replace whatever it is, whatever the recommendation is. Oh, that's cool as shit. That's good.
Perhaps more popular is actually the volume based. Yeah. So I will send you a notification every time you've lost, let's say 4 ounces. Again, completely customizable if you want that 5, 10, 12, whatever. But that one's really popular in the sense that you can just go about your workout, completely tune out any of the data, but you will get feedback haptically on your watch or whatever the case may be to say, okay, you've crossed that 4 ounce threshold again, go ahead and drink that 4 ounces. Whether that notification comes every 4 minutes or every 14 minutes has everything to do with how quickly you're sweating, but you're getting that consistent notification.
I'd use that, by the way. This is why this whole thing is so intriguing. If I had an athlete that was not great, anything but not great. If I had an athlete that's really good with their hydration, I'd kind of leave them alone. Don't mess with it. Right. But if they're average or below average, which is more than half, way more than half, I would use it in just that fashion. We're going to go out, we're going to build your profile, and then during the race, we're going to put this thing in your ear so you don't have to think about it. Because in ultra, it's hard. Like, you get 10 hours into a race and you're all foggy and you're not, it's hard to like figure out the fluid volume in your hydration pack or whatever you're using, your bottles or whatever, like that. I think that's the killer use case in my opinion. And really, if you think about it from a high performance standpoint, Breaking 2 projects, right? They're
Yeah,
rolling up on a bike and drink this. Don't think about it, just drink it. They don't have
that's
the
right.
data, they don't have the real-time data, but they've used a predictive model to insert whatever they're trying to do, fluid, electrolytes, energy,
Absolutely.
kind of whatever it is. It's the
Absolutely.
same thing, but you're basing it off of what's going on in real time from a hydration
Exactly.
perspective.
Exactly. And it's funny that you mentioned breaking two, because we actually work with Brad Wilkins, who is the
Yeah.
physiologist on breaking two. He's on our advisory board, but that's exactly the sort of design centric experience that we tried to create for that athlete, right? No one's trying to do any head math. Nobody's trying to do any ratios or calculations when they're, on the roads. We're trying to make it easy. But both of those use cases I just mentioned, by the way, really work for athletes that are carrying their fluids with them. And that may not always be the case. There may be athletes that are relying on aid stations or water stops, hydration stops. For those scenarios, you use it exactly the way that you use any other data feature on your Garmin, for example. So you'd come up to that aid station, you'd look at your watch and say, all right, I've cumulatively lost, 9 ounces, whatever the case may be. Consume that. We actually do have a feature on there that's optional where you can log what you've replenished. So if you're somebody that carries fluids, you drink that 9 ounces at the aid station, you hit a quick little, like the lap function on your Garmin, same concept, single button tap. It will reset that back to 0 for you so that when you get to the next aid station, it's just what you've lost since the last time you replenished. Like really trying to make it foolproof.
That's rad. So it's Garmin compatible now through Garmin IQ
That's
or
right.
through
Yeah.
Garmin IQ? Yeah.
Yep.
That's so
Exactly.
rad. That's so
Yep.
rad. So
Thanks.
you get the data on your Garmin on the phone.
Yeah.
Anywhere else? Any other watch compatibility?
We did the Apple Watch integration is real simple. We know that's a much, less frequently used device among endurance athletes, but it's an easy integration. So we did include that one. That's all we have for hardware integrations right now. Little sneak peek is we are looking at other hardware integration partnerships to come. With folks and software ones as well, like folks like Wahoo and Zwift and, Training Peaks and Strava. These are all kind of part of the pipeline. And they all make it really easy with open APIs.
Yeah. Well, it's like I said from the onset, I think that you're solving a real problem there. That use case is one that hundreds and thousands of athletes have gone through. I come into an
Yeah,
aid station. I don't know how far behind I am on fluids. Am I
right,
supposed to drink all I can? Am I supposed to
right,
drink to thirst? Am I supposed to
right,
do whatever? And everybody's trying to help. And usually there's like five
right.
differences of opinion right there. If you've got the gold standard, A, you know that you're going to perform better at the end of the day. B, you're less likely to make a critical mistake. And in ultra,
Yeah,
we actually have to worry about that. We have to worry about people
absolutely.
making critical mistakes and getting sent to the hospital or whatever.
Right.
But C, people don't appreciate how much the mental energy costs.
Mhm.
And this is when I used to have this debate with people about drinking to thirst or drinking on a schedule. And it seemed like 5 or 7 years ago, people would still argue on the drinking to thirst piece just being efficacious in itself or more efficacious than itself versus
Yeah.
drinking on some sort of schedule that you've
Yep.
selectively designed.
Yep.
Now that that research is generally flushed out and those people have kind of quieted down, the knock becomes it's too hard, right? It's too
Yeah.
hard, especially in ultra where the temperature changes a lot and your hydration
Yes.
needs change a lot. To figure that out in real time takes a lot of mental energy, and sometimes the mental energy isn't worth it. But if you take
Right.
that component out, I think you've got a big advantage.
Yeah. No, I'm glad that you said that, because that's also been an important feature from us from the beginning is how do we just literally automate this for people? Like take it out of the mental calculus that they're trying to do to create, especially on race day, but in training too.
Can you paint any other feedback from the users that you've had out there in the field, like just so people who are listening can be like, oh yeah, this person experienced that. I identify with it as well.
Oh gosh, I mean, we've heard such a range of feedback. I mean, everything from, being able to, sort of think about the patch as like a safety net that, how many features do we think about of impacting whether we have a really strong run or we have a bad run, right? There's hydration, nutrition, sleep, fueling, fitness. I mean, hydration, as we know, is absolutely one of the most impactful. So some of the feedback we've gotten is like the ability to just slap a patch on, get data on the device I'm already using, and just take the hydration risk off the table. If we're doing our job right, that's, that's kind of the baseline value proposition right
The
there.
simplicity of it, right?
The simplicity
Because
of it.
I mean, so we talked about this at the running event. So I recently released that book that I was talking about there,
Yeah.
and we use the standardized sweat test and things like that. And yes, it's only getting total body water loss, not the electrolyte composition at that point. But I think that that's the simplest thing. And I bang my head against the friggin' desk every time I try to get an athlete to do it, and they don't, or they forget, or they have their clothes on during one and not during the other.
Exactly.
Or they're still holding their water bottle at the end of the day. It's just
right.
oh my God,
Or they used the restroom before they did the weight, like whatever the case may be. I mean, no, it's the simplicity of it. I will say too, we alluded to this earlier too, is that if we can, I keep talking about fluid losses and electrolyte losses as the two main data drivers, and they are, but the one that we create out of the ratio of the two of those is sweat composition. So on average, what is the electrolyte content of your sweat? And of course, again, this varies with every workout, but if that can be a key part of this profile as well, and we can say, your electrolyte loss is in the range of 32 milligrams per ounce, and put it in a unit of measure that's actually usable, right? Here in the US, we think about fluids in ounces and electrolytes in milligrams. So if we make it something you can literally read off the package of your hydration brand of choice, again, we are agnostic, it can help you figure out in this spectrum of, like, I think Morton has something like 17 milligrams per ounce of electrolytes, and Element is like closer to 100. So if you know where you sit in that spectrum, it can do two things. It can help you pick the product that's best for you, or we can help you mix, how many packets of Morton into how many ounces of water to create a beverage that's perfectly in sync with your sweat composition.
Yeah, the listeners of the podcast will remember the interview that I did with Andy Blow, where his company Precision Hydration is using an at home, at rest type of way
brilliant.
to manage electrolyte, or to determine electrolyte composition. And they're putting people in buckets, right? Low, medium, high, and I think they have like extra high now or something like that. But your device can do the same thing. And then you can go out into the commercial market space and say, this product exactly with this electrolyte composition suits my needs. And you're right, it is a huge drain, and almost nobody understands it.
Right. And that's something that our commercial team is trying to think about too, is like, there really is a very wide range of sort of sophistication and savvy with that data. And I imagine most of your listeners are probably on the upper end of that, of really having dialed into hydration and nutrition. But there are a lot of folks that go out there and wing it, and they still do trial and error without a lot of, really getting into the data of it. So we may have a little bit of work ahead of us to educate some of our users on, when we say that you've lost 200 milligrams of electrolytes, what does that mean exactly? And what are you supposed to do about it?
Yeah, I think that's going to be the more illuminating piece of it, is the matching on the user side of it, is matching the product specifically to the electrolyte composition that's showing up on the patch. That's cool. Okay. How can people get a hold of this? We've created like the least compelling sell ever because it was way too technical. We don't have the set. People appreciate it. I told Meredith at the running events, like, don't bring your salespeople on, because I'll tear them apart. Bring the people who know what they're talking about. Make sure it's practical. Make sure it's not too salesy. Let's talk about the holes and flaws and, moles and hairs and wrinkles and things like that are on products, because they're everywhere.
That's right.
So where is it in the commercial space? If somebody listening wanted to go and buy it right now and start dorking around with it, trying to figure out their hydration strategy for their next ultra marathon, how would they go about doing it?
Yeah, well, it's well timed that we're looking at shipping finished product early this spring. So just in time for training and spring racing season. But pre-orders are in fact open right now. So our website, preorders.nixbiosensors.com, Nix is spelled Nix. That's open. So anybody who's interested can go get in there. We're not even taking payment information right now. We'll do that when we ship finished product. But first and foremost, this helps us understand what category of athletes is really in highest demand for the product. But also it's more of a functional piece for us. It helps us understand what our orders to our contract manufacturers should look like as a brand new product, a brand new, product category. there are no comps out there for us. So this helps us really dial in what the demand is going to look like.
I appreciate that. And you don't want stuff sitting on shelves either.
Yeah,
That's the other flaw that you can make that.
exactly.
Okay. So
Exactly.
I'll put a link to that in the show notes. If anybody out there is curious, go and check it out. I will put in pre-order, and after the full disclosure,
Awesome.
Meredith says there's no comps. I'm going to pay full price. I'm going to probably ship a few to my athletes and see what the use cases are and things like that. I really do honestly think that you solve a problem, you do it in a way that works. You're not overselling your stuff, which irritates the bejesus out of me.
Yep.
And in ultra very specifically, I think this is a mission critical area to figure out. Hydration always comes first, then nutrition comes second, and if you can figure out the hydration part, it almost always takes care of itself.
No, I love that. We love hearing from athletes too. I will add that in. There may be needs or features or idea, and we are constantly soliciting feedback. So there is a contact email address at the bottom of that webpage that I just mentioned. Don't hesitate to reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you.
Awesome, Meredith. Well, thanks for coming on the podcast. Other than your website, Nick's Hydration, I always screw up people's websites. Hold on, I just had it right here.
Nick's
Biosensors. There we go. Nick's Biosensors.
Yeah.
Is there anywhere else where people can get a hold of you, your team, or your work, or learn more about what you guys have cooking?
That's the best place. There's contact information right there on the website that will get you directly to us as well.
Okay, sweet. Thanks for coming on the podcast. I appreciate
Thanks
it. Good luck to you.
Me.
I hope to bring you back in 2 years once all the validation research comes out, and we'll talk about that and then what iterations you have had over the product over that time frame.
That'd be awesome. So good to see you, Jason. Thanks.
All right, folks, there you have it. There you go. Much thanks to Meredith for coming on the podcast today. And I can't emphasize enough how excited I am for this market to come out in the marketplace. And I am not one to get excited about these things, but I've learned over the course of my coaching career that there are always companies that are going to come up out on the marketplace, and some of them are going to make it and other ones are not. And throughout all of that experience, I think I have a pretty good nose as to how to differentiate between those two groups. And I think Meredith and her team, they are onto something. It solves a very important question that we have in sports science and in endurance sports. And they also do it in a very practical way that everyday athletes can get their hands on. So I'm excited to see what they do in the space. I'm going to go on their pre-orders and order a couple of batches and use them for myself and send them out to my athletes and see what they think. Whether or not you do it yourself or not, you are going to have to be the ultimate determinant of that. There are no discounts for you guys listening out there. Hashtag sorry, not sorry about that. I appreciate all of the listeners out there today. If you like this podcast, share it with your friends and your training buddies. It helps out a tremendous amount to get the word out about this podcast. I'm also very appreciative of when I get to meet people out at races and who recognize me just from talking to some stranger just through my voice, and they get to come up and ask a follow-up question out in the real world. I'm going to be at Black Canyons in just a few weeks, and so if you are there, come and hit me up. I'll be by my adventure van. I'd love to talk shop with you. That is it for today. Appreciate the heck out of you, and as always, we will see you out on the trails.